Late April 1943, the last days of the North African campaign. In the quiet groves outside Tunis, the wind moved softly through the twisted branches of olive trees. Between the shadows of the trunks, something vast and unnatural stood still, a shape of steel, angular, sun-faded, dust settling on its heavy hull. A Tiger tank, abandoned, silent, perfectly intact. Its long 88mm gun stretched across the grove like a spear aimed at nothing. The crew had vanished, the hatches left open. No demolition charges, no fire scars. A machine built to terrify entire armies now stood motionless, forgotten in the dirt. The serial number painted on its side read 712. The Allies would soon call it Tiger 712, the most valuable intelligence prize of the North African War. When British engineers of the Royal, Electrical and Mechanical Engineers first reached the site, they could hardly believe what they were looking at. Weeks of fierce fighting had filled Tunisia with wreckage, burned-out panzers, shattered trucks, twisted gun carriages, but never a Tiger left whole. The Germans always destroyed their heavy equipment before retreating. Yet here was the most feared tank in existence, left unscathed among the olive trees. In the distance, the guns had already fallen silent. By May, Axis resistance in Tunisia was collapsing everywhere. Between the 7th and 13th of that month, roughly 230,000 German and Italian troops laid down their arms. The Afrika Korps ceased to exist, but long before the surrender, the Tiger had already earned its legend. The first of these massive machines had reached Tunisia the previous November, shipped from Europe aboard transports hurriedly diverted south after Rommel's retreat from El Alamein. They belonged to Heavy Panzer Battalion 501, one of Germany's elite armored units. 20 Tigers in total, supported by 16 Panzer IIIs, had been sent to reinforce the crumbling front. For the first time, Allied soldiers in Africa would face the same weapon that had shocked Soviet tankers months earlier near Leningrad. Reports from the Eastern Front had described a monster, a tank weighing over 55 tons, with armor thick enough to shrug off any shell, and a main gun capable of killing from beyond 2 kilometers. Allied intelligence officers were skeptical at first. To men who had spent the Desert War fighting thin-skinned Panzer IIIs and IVs, such a weapon sounded exaggerated, almost mythical. But the myth would become reality in February 1943 at Fide Pass. On February 14th, the German army launched Operation Frühlingswind, Spring Wind, a counteroffensive designed to shatter newly arrived American forces in central Tunisia. Leading the attack were Tigers of Heavy Panzer Battalion 501. Against them stood Combat Command A of the U.S. 1st Armored Division, supported by Sherman tanks whose 75mm guns were barely adequate against older German armor, let alone the new Tiger. The results were devastating. In the fighting around Sidi Bouzid and later at Kasserine Pass, American tank units were mauled. The Tigers struck from long range, their 88mm shells punching through Shermans before the Americans could even see their attackers. Crews spoke afterwards of shells ricocheting helplessly off the Tigers' frontal plates, while return fire tore through their ranks. The psychological effect was immediate and profound. Among the Allied soldiers, the word Tiger became synonymous with invincibility. Even where none were present, rumors of their appearance spread panic. Medical officers began recording a condition they quietly called Tiger phobia. Tank crews paralyzed by fear at the mere report that a Tiger was operating nearby. Artillery barrages were called in on empty hillsides. Air support was requested before any movement forward. The myth of the Tiger had become its own weapon, and yet the truth behind the myth was more complicated. On the battlefield, surveys conducted weeks after the engagements at Sidi Bouzid, American analysts discovered that the vast majority of destroyed tanks had not been hit by Tigers at all, but by the more common 50 and 75mm guns of Panzer IIIs and IVs. Only a single Sherman had actually been penetrated by an 88mm round. The Tiger's real power lay not in numbers but in terror. Even so, its battlefield performance impressed all who encountered it. With frontal armor up to 100mm thick and a gun capable of accurate fire beyond 2 kilometers, it could kill anything the Allies fielded. The Sherman 75mm gun could not reliably penetrate a Tiger's side armor unless within 300 meters, a suicidal distance. For Allied crews, facing one of these beasts felt hopeless. But behind the armor and the engineering brilliance, cracks were already forming. The Tiger was mechanically complex and extraordinarily heavy. Its Maybach engine strained under the load, and the overlapping road wheels, though providing smooth travel, jammed easily with mud and sand. Maintenance was constant. More critically, the fuel consumption was staggering. Keeping a single Tiger operational required a constant stream of fuel trucks, spare parts, and specialized mechanics. As the German situation in Tunisia worsened, these lifelines began to break down. By early 1943, Allied air superiority made supply lines increasingly vulnerable. Convoys were bombed, ports were blockaded, and fuel was rationed so tightly that many vehicles were ordered to move only at night. The Tigers, with their enormous appetite for gasoline, became prisoners of their own power. The battalion's war diary, later captured by British forces, recorded the decline in painful detail. When the Tigers first arrived in December 1942, 20 were operational. By the end of the month, 14 remained. A week later, only 11. Spare engines were unavailable. Tracks wore out faster than replacements could be shipped. Crews cannibalized parts from damaged tanks to keep others moving. And through it all, the shortage of fuel grew critical. By March, the diary reported only 6 Tigers still operational. The rest sat silent, awaiting repairs that would never come. On April 20th, the final entry captured the desperation of collapse. Allied forces were breaking through on all fronts. Orders came to retreat toward Tunis, but the battalion lacked fuel even for that. Demolition teams were assigned to destroy any tank that could not move. But there were too many to destroy, and too few men left to carry out the work. In the confusion of withdrawal, Tiger 712 was abandoned in an olive grove. Perhaps the crew expected the demolition teams to arrive later. Perhaps they simply fled to survive. No one ever knew. When Allied engineers reached the grove weeks later, they found not only Tiger 712 but several other German vehicles. One Tiger destroyed, another partially dismantled, and a Panzer III nearby. The scene suggested a makeshift field workshop hastily deserted. The ground was littered with tools, oil drums, and a few scattered documents. Tiger 712 stood complete, its turret locked forward, its armor unscarred. Lieutenant Sewell of the 104th Tank Workshop, Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, wrote the first detailed inspection report. He noted that the tank was functional and intact, its systems apparently undamaged. The discovery was immediately classified and relayed up the chain of command. Within days, American liaison officers were informed. In Washington and London, intelligence branches understood the significance. For the first time, the Allies possessed a complete undamaged Tiger tank. Word reached Colonel George B. Jarrett, chief of the Foreign Material Branch at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Jarrett had spent months collecting wreckage and reports of German armor, but never had a full example of the Tiger. His message to command was simple: secure it, ship it, and study it. The recovery operation was as extraordinary as the find itself. The Tiger weighed nearly 57 tons, far beyond the capacity of standard Allied recovery vehicles. The Americans used multiple M31 recovery tanks in tandem, along with bulldozers and heavy tractors. Movement was painfully slow. Every bridge and culvert along the route to Tunis had to be tested for load capacity. Where bridges could not hold, engineers built temporary bypasses from timber and steel plate. The convoy traveled mostly at night, partly to avoid Luftwaffe attack, partly because the heat of day made the engines overheat. The journey from the grove to the port, a distance of barely 50 kilometers, took 3 days. Once in Tunis, port engineers faced an even greater problem: lifting the massive tank onto a ship. The only available cranes rated for 70 tons were tied up unloading cargo. Arrangements were made for the Liberty ship Samuel P. Bush to carry the tank across the Atlantic. On May 26, 1943, Tiger 712 was hoisted aboard in its steel cradle, secured with chains and prepared for the long voyage. The ship sailed soon after, part of a convoy bound for Norfolk, Virginia. The Tiger would cross the same ocean that had carried American troops to Africa, but in reverse, a prisoner of war made of steel. The voyage lasted nearly 3 weeks. At Norfolk, dockworkers stared at the cargo in disbelief. Many had read about the new German supertanks, but never imagined seeing one up close. From Norfolk, the Tiger was placed on a reinforced rail car designed for heavy artillery pieces and sent north to Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. It arrived in mid-July 1943. At Aberdeen, engineers and ordnance officers had been preparing for months. They had studied every fragment of intelligence on the Tiger, blueprints captured in Tunisia, field reports from Soviet sources, and testimonies from soldiers who had faced it in battle. Now, with a real machine in front of them, they could finally test everything. Brigadier General Gladian M. Barnes, Chief of Research and Development for Army Ordnance, oversaw the project personally. His instructions to the test teams were unambiguous. Examine the Tiger in every possible detail: its armor, its gun, its engine, its mechanical reliability, and its logistical requirements. The Tiger represented the pinnacle of German armored design. To defeat it, they had to understand it. Initial inspections revealed craftsmanship of the highest order. The welding was flawless. The interleaved road wheels and torsion bar suspension gave the tank remarkable stability. The Maybach HL-230 engine, a 12-cylinder powerhouse, produced nearly 700 horsepower, enough to move the tank at 38 kilometers per hour on roads. The transmission, with 8 forward and 4 reverse gears, allowed it to back away from combat almost as quickly as it could advance. American engineers were impressed, even grudgingly admiring. They compared it to the Sherman, smaller, faster, simpler, and noted that while the Tiger was over-engineered, it was also a masterpiece of precision. The 88mm KWK-36 gun, derived from the famous anti-aircraft cannon, was devastatingly accurate. At Aberdeen's firing range, it punched through Allied test plates at ranges no other tank gun could match. But admiration soon gave way to analysis, and then concern. The Tiger's armor was formidable, yes. Its gun was unmatched, but the specifications for fuel capacity and range raised eyebrows. With 4 fuel tanks holding a total of just over 500 liters, the Tiger's endurance seemed extremely limited for such a massive machine. German manuals claimed a range of 195 kilometers on roads, roughly 120 miles, and about 110 kilometers cross-country. Even those numbers seemed optimistic. When the Aberdeen tests began in earnest later that summer, fuel consumption was given top priority. The Americans understood that warfare was as much about logistics as firepower. A tank that could not move far without refueling would always be strategically limited, no matter how powerful it was in a single engagement. The first tests confirmed German claims under ideal conditions. On paved roads traveling at steady speed, Tiger 712 achieved about 1.2 miles per gallon. But once testing shifted to rough ground, sand, mud, slopes, water crossings, consumption skyrocketed. Crews found the Tiger burning nearly 4 gallons per mile. In simulated combat maneuvers, it reached 6 gallons per mile. These numbers shocked even seasoned engineers. Under battlefield conditions, the Tiger could travel barely 25 miles before its tanks ran dry. That meant any prolonged engagement or any forced retreat risked immobilizing the vehicle long before enemy fire did. At that moment, the Tiger's secret weakness, the one the olive grove in Tunisia had already hinted at, became unmistakable. The machine that terrified Allied crews was not defeated by its armor or gun, but by its hunger. When the Aberdeen Proving Ground team finished their first series of trials, they were certain of one thing. The Tiger was not simply a weapon. It was an entire system of logistics disguised as a tank. Every movement demanded a small army of mechanics, drivers, and fuel trucks. Keeping just one vehicle running for a day's operation consumed resources that could have powered half a company of Shermans. Engineers set out to quantify that burden. They measured the tank's consumption on different surfaces, logging every gallon and every mile. The data was relentless. On roads, Tiger 712 managed around 195 liters for every 100 kilometers, roughly 1.2 miles per gallon. On soft ground, the figure tripled. Under simulated battle conditions, when the driver had to accelerate, halt, pivot, and idle for minutes at a time while the turret swung in search of targets, the fuel gauge dropped like a stone. 6 gallons per mile, 23 miles to exhaustion. That number spread quickly through the intelligence community. To field commanders reading the reports, it meant one simple thing. The Tiger could fight magnificently, but not for long. Colonel Barnes ordered a full logistics comparison. American medium tank battalions, he discovered, averaged about 65,000 gallons of fuel per week, to operate 53 Shermans and all their supporting vehicles. A German heavy tank battalion with only 20 Tigers required almost the same, sometimes more, just to keep its own tanks moving. When ammunition trucks, half-tracks, and repair lorries were added, the total fuel demand of a Tiger battalion exceeded that of an entire American armored regiment. It was a staggering imbalance. The figures went into a series of classified memoranda circulated to armor commands in October 1943. The message was clear. The Tiger's greatest strength could be turned against it. Starve it of fuel, and it became a fortress with no foundation. Inside the proving ground workshops, mechanics kept the tests going. They disassembled gearboxes, weighed components, measured armor thickness, and fired captured 75mm and 76mm rounds at different angles. They learned that even the Tiger's celebrated armor had blind spots, thin plates behind the road wheels, vulnerable joints around the turret ring. Yet these discoveries were secondary to the larger revelation taking shape in the notebooks of the analysts. No matter how thick the armor, the tank could not escape the laws of supply. The American Ordnance Branch built entire training films from the findings. One reel, Understanding German Heavy Tanks, opened with an image of Tiger 712 crawling across the test field while a narrator explained its appetite. Each mile this tank travels, he said, costs 3 to 6 gallons of gasoline. The Sherman can travel the same mile on less than one. The lesson followed immediately. Make the Tiger move. Draw it out. Force it to burn its own strength away. Across the Atlantic, British and American tacticians absorbed the same message. Air commanders were instructed that destroying fuel depots and convoys could cripple heavy armor operations as effectively as bombing tank factories. Every Tiger that ran out of fuel was one less Tiger to face in battle. By the time these doctrines filtered to the front, the Tiger had already begun to suffer the consequences of its own design. In Italy, battalion logs recorded long stretches where tanks were ordered to remain static because supply convoys could not reach them through Allied air interdiction. In Normandy the following summer, heavy SS Panzer Battalion 101, one of the most feared units in the German army, documented the same agony. On July 8, 1944, after destroying 16 Shermans and 3 Cromwells, the battalion reported total fuel exhaustion. The Tigers sat immobilized for hours while British forces withdrew. There was no pursuit. The tanks simply couldn't move. 12 days later, fuel allocations were cut by 40%, and headquarters ordered them to conserve every drop. The best tanks in Europe, one officer wrote bitterly, sit idle for want of fuel. 2 weeks after that, during the retreat from the Falaise pocket, crews abandoned several perfectly functional Tigers. They wired demolition charges inside the hulls but were uncertain whether the explosions succeeded. The men walked out under cover of darkness, leaving the steel giants behind, mute evidence of a war running on empty. Captured documents from other fronts told the same story. In the east, the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking logged endless requests for fuel that never came. In Italy, the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion recorded tanks stranded halfway through planned redeployments. The diary entries blended into a single refrain, "Keine Benzin mehr, no more gasoline." Aberdeen's findings now had proof on the battlefield. The monster was consuming itself. At the proving ground, engineers completed the mechanical endurance tests by winter. They had run the Tiger across every obstacle course available, then torn it down to the last bolt. The parts were cataloged, weighed, and compared against American standards. The final report ran hundreds of pages. It praised German craftsmanship, the precision machining of the gun, the excellent optical sights, the advanced suspension. But it also highlighted the flaws that no engineering could overcome. Excessive complexity, fragile components that failed under dust and heat, and a supply requirement utterly incompatible with Germany's shrinking fuel reserves. When Barnes read the report in January 1944, he underlined one sentence and read, "Immobilized Tigers cannot fight." He sent copies to every major armored command in the European and Mediterranean theaters. Within months, the lessons shaped Allied tactics tank crews were trained to exploit their mobility advantage. In field briefings, instructors told them that if a Tiger appeared, they should avoid direct confrontation, maneuver rapidly, and call for artillery or fighter bombers to pin it down. Each time the German tank moved its 60-ton bulk, it burned irreplaceable fuel, The longer the fight stretched, the weaker it became. When Allied air power matured in 1944, those doctrines proved decisive. The same skies that denied the Afrika Korps their supply lines now did the same to the panzer divisions of France. Every convoy hit, every train destroyed, shortened the reach of the Tiger. Even when the tanks survived the bombings, the fuel in their drums did not. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine in early 1945, many heavy tank units existed only on paper. The German army still built Tigers, but too often they rolled off the assembly line straight into depots with no gasoline to fill them. The machines that once symbolized unstoppable strength had become monuments to industrial overreach. Back in Maryland, Tiger 712 sat quietly in its test shed, paint peeling, its engine drained of oil. It had served its purpose. From it, the Allies had learned not only the specifications of a weapon, but the deeper principle of modern war. That power must be sustained to matter. Engineers photographed every detail before the tank was moved to outdoor display. Soldiers visiting the proving ground would stand beside it, posing for pictures, astonished by its size. Few realized that the hulking relic in front of them had changed the way their own armies fought. For historians, the story of Tiger 712 became more than a curiosity. It was a parable about the limits of technology and war. Germany's engineers had achieved brilliance, but brilliance without resources is only half a weapon. The Tiger was a masterpiece that could not live beyond the range of its own fuel trucks. Years later, when military theorists studied the campaigns of the Second World War, they often returned to that olive grove near Tunis where the first intact Tiger had been found. There, among the trees, the myth of invincibility had met the reality of logistics. The tank that once terrified entire divisions had surrendered silently to physics, to distance, to consumption, to the simple arithmetic of supply. In the larger sweep of the war, the Tiger's downfall foreshadowed the fate of the army that built it. As Allied bombers shattered refineries and railways, fuel became rarer than steel. Jets, tanks, trucks, all the machinery of modern warfare, fell silent one after another. What began as a mechanical limitation ended as a strategic catastrophe. The Aberdeen reports, once classified, later entered the archives. Engineers who had worked on the tests went on to design the next generation of American tanks. The Pershing, the Patton, machines that balanced firepower with mobility and endurance. In every design meeting, someone inevitably recalled the Tiger's lesson. Never build a tank your fuel system can't feed. Today, Tiger 712 still exists, preserved under museum lights, its yellow paint faded to a dull ochre, its steel plates scarred by time. Visitors stare up at its massive gun and imagine the terror it inspired. Yet the true story is quieter. Beneath the armor lies an empty fuel tank, the very emptiness that betrayed it. In the end, that emptiness speaks louder than the roar of its engine ever did. It tells how wars are won not only by courage or by weapons, but by the invisible rivers of fuel and supply that keep them alive. The Tiger taught that lesson the hard way. When the sun sets through the museum windows, its light catching the edges of that great machine, it almost seems alive again, ready to move, to fight, to reclaim its legend. But it never will. The tank that once embodied power now stands as proof of a simple truth. In war, as in industry, endurance outweighs might. The men who found Tiger 712 in that olive grove could not have known how much it would reveal. They saw only an abandoned vehicle left behind by a defeated army. But from that silent shell came insights that shaped the future of armored warfare. The men who found Tiger 712 in that olive grove could not have known how much it would reveal. They saw only an abandoned vehicle, left behind by a defeated army. But from that silent shell came insights that shaped the future of armored warfare. Lessons written not in glory or heroism, but in fuel figures and range tables. So the story ends where it began, in silence. The grove in Tunisia is long overgrown. The tracks of the Tiger vanished under soil and roots, yet the echo of its engine still lingers in every military planner's mind. A reminder that even the strongest weapon is powerless once the fuel runs dry.